I think it's fair to say when it comes to the good people of the United States of America, something they're not entirely famous for is their ability with other languages apart from English.
We need just American, okay?
However, this is actually a reputation that they really don't deserve historically. Because did you know that in 1910, over 2 million people spoke German as a first language in the United States? And of course, there were many more immigrants who spoke a whole host of other languages, let alone some of the native languages in America too. Now, in 2000, there are still around 1.5 million people who speak German as a first language, but were born in the United States of America. Particularly Texas is famous, but there are German speakers throughout the entire country, as you can see here on this map, particularly in areas like the Midwest and scattered around the country. In fact, you may even have heard that at one point, the actual official language of the United States of America might have become German, and that this was only stopped by one vote being cast in favor of English rather than German. And this really leaves the mind to boggle, to have a German United States of America instead of an English one. What would a German-American accent sound like? Instead of the USA, we would have the VSA. We would have the Vereinigte Staaten von Amerika instead of the United States of America. What would this have meant for history? Of course, in our timeline in 1917, the Americans joined the First World War and helped the Allies on the Western Front and on the seas. And perhaps even more importantly, in 1941, the Americans joined the Second World War and would eventually aid in defeating the Germans in Europe and their allies. That special relationship that sort of emerged after the two world wars between the United States and the United Kingdom, well, if they didn't share a language, would that relationship have been and still be to this day with Germany? How might things have looked in a world where the United States was culturally and linguistically more German rather than Anglophone? Now, there's one thing I should probably mention about this idea that German almost became the first language, the official language of the United States of America. There's one problem with it.
It was bollocks.
Yeah, and actually it's referred to as the Muhlenberg Legend because this is a commonly recited fact that actually has no real basis or historical truth. So there are several ideas behind where this myth actually came from. Most of them center around the figure of Friedrich Muhlenberg, or Frederick Muhlenberg for the Americans and other English speakers in the audience, who was himself the son of a German immigrant to the United States and would go on to become the first Speaker of the US House of Representatives following independence from the British. Now, most state that this was in the very early years of the United States of America, but this conflates somewhat the history of when most German immigrants would arrive in the United States, as at this point in time, most of the immigrants in the United States of America were very much from England, Scotland, and Ireland, and so English was sort of the de facto language of the early United States of America. In fact, to this day, the United States of America doesn't actually have an official language, and so this vote never took place because, well, there simply was never a question of what is an official language. English has sort of always been the de facto language that was used. In fact, it varies on a state-to-state level. Many states don't have an official language at all. They simply, for the most part, use English. Other states do have English as the official language, while certain other states, particularly those with large native populations, so looking at Alaska, Hawaii, South Dakota, for example, have multiple languages, with some of these native languages also being an official language in the state. Now, as mentioned, during this time period of the late 18th century, most of those involved in the American political system were native English speakers. And so there was never a question on what the official language of this new state had to actually be in the end anyway. So where does this idea of the myth actually originate from? Well, some say that it goes back to 1794 and that there is a kernel of truth in the story, which is that a group of German immigrants arrived and they asked for something to be translated into German. And then that this story was taken out of proportion time and again and retold, and that then the story emerged of, did the United States vote to make German the official language? Another often popularized story came from this gentleman, Franz von Löhe, who was a visitor to the United States in 1847 and would go on to write the German language textbook Geschichte und Zustände der Deutschen in Amerika. Now, he visited in 1847 the United States, particularly Pennsylvania, which, as you may know if you watched my previous video on the Amish, has a significant population of those who speak Pennsylvania Dutch, which isn't a Dutch dialect but rather a dialect of German. Now, when he visited, he reports on there being a vote in the state of Pennsylvania on what the official language of that state should be. However, that wasn't the vote on an official language for the entire United States of America. Something where the confusion may have come from is that the US Congress at the time was sitting in Philadelphia, which was the capital of the state of Pennsylvania. And so perhaps this is where this conflation of the two has come from. And ultimately, in the end, Pennsylvania didn't vote to make German its official state language. I think perhaps interest in this myth sort of increased in the United States, one, because so many German-speaking immigrants arrived, particularly from the 1840s onwards, and two, because of course in both the First World War and then in the Second World War, the Americans fought against the Germans in Europe. And so it's a very sort of interesting counterfactual to think, oh, how would things have been if the official language of the United States was German, and then the idea that one vote, perhaps world history would have been completely changed. Notwithstanding, it's a fun story, but it is a fake story. It didn't actually happen, and that's why in the 1940s it started to become referred to as the Muhlenberg Legend, so after this figure of Friedrich Muhlenberg. Now, as I've made other videos on this as well, many different immigrant languages made it to the United States of America. And there was even, in fact, a Frisian-speaking town in Wisconsin, which is really interesting. So check out that video if you are interested. And let me know in the comments below what other videos on similar topics would you like to see. And which one would you have voted for if this had actually happened, if you were Friedrich Muhlenberg? Would you have made the USA, the VSA? Would you have made German the official language? Kind of an interesting counterfactual, I suppose. But I think given the way that most of those, certainly the more powerful early immigrants to the United States came from places like England and Scotland and Ireland, I think English was probably always going to win out there as the main language. But it's certainly interesting to think. You know, I sometimes wonder the Dutch managed to get hold of Brazil for a few decades. If they'd have held on to it instead of the Portuguese, would we now see a kind of Dutch language being spoken there? Could they, perhaps have had some similar kind of developments to Afrikaans? It's an interesting counterfactual. Certainly didn't happen in Indonesia. There's very little Dutch that's spoken there to this day. So, I mean, these are interesting things to consider. Anyway, thanks very much for watching. I have been Hilbert, and this has been The History. Auf Wiedersehen.